The saw's teeth bite into flesh just as the first light breaks over Trent. No trial, no mercy, no time for prayer. Just the brutal mathematics of wood and bone, and a man's screams swallowed by the indifferent dawn. This is not a story of heroes. This is a story of how truth dies when fear becomes law, and how justice can wear the face of demons. In the spring of 1475, the Italian city of Trent convulsed with a horror that would stain its streets for centuries. A child was missing. Simon, barely 3 years old, had vanished from his home near the Jewish quarter on the evening before Passover. When his small body was found days later in a drainage canal near the house of Samuel, a Jewish leader, the city's grief turned to rage. The whispers began immediately, fed by old hatreds and newer fears. Blood libel, they said, ritual murder. The ancient lie that Jews killed Christian children for their blood, a fabrication as old as prejudice itself, found fertile ground in Trent's cobblestone streets. The Prince Bishop, Johannes Hinderbach, saw not a tragedy but an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate his power and his piety in one terrible stroke. Samuel stood in chains within hours, his hands still bearing the calluses of honest work, his eyes reflecting the firelight of torches held by men he had known as neighbors. He was a respected merchant, a man of learning who had lived peacefully among Christians for decades, who had traded fairly and prayed quietly. But now he was something else entirely. He was a monster conjured by fear, a scapegoat demanded by a city's grief. Around him stood 14 other Jews from Trent's small community, all arrested, all accused of participating in a murder that existed more in imagination than in evidence. The bishop's interrogators came with their tools, their racks and their brands, their screws designed to extract confession from innocence. They asked their questions with iron and fire, and when the answers came, soaked in blood and desperation, they wrote them down as truth. The confessions arrived in screams. Under torture, men will say anything, will confess to crimes they never committed, will invent details to satisfy their torturers and end the agony even for a moment. Samuel, his body broken on the rack, his fingers crushed in thumbscrews, admitted to things he had never done. He spoke of rituals that existed only in the fevered minds of his accusers, of ceremonies drawn from Christian fantasy rather than Jewish practice. The other prisoners, subjected to similar torments, corroborated his forced testimony. They signed their names to lies written in their own blood. But among them was one man whose confession carried a different weight, whose words would seal not just his own fate but transform him into a symbol. His name was Moses, sometimes called the Old in the records, a man whose age should have earned him respect but instead made him vulnerable. Moses had been a teacher, a scholar of the Talmud, who had spent his life studying texts and debating fine points of law with other learned men. His beard had gone gray in the service of wisdom, his eyes had weakened reading by candlelight, his hands had grown soft from holding books rather than tools. He was not a man built for violence, not a man who could have overpowered a child or participated in the elaborate murder his torturers described. But under torture, even scholars break. The pain strips away learning, reduces philosophy to animal sounds, turns the mind into something that will do or say anything to survive another moment. When Moses confessed, when he spoke the words the bishop's men wanted to hear, he became the principal witness. His testimony, extracted through agony, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. He was the accuser, the one whose words would hang the others. The trial was a performance, a ritual of law that had already decided its verdict. The courtroom in Trent's palazzo was packed with citizens hungry for justice or revenge, the distinction between the two having long since dissolved. The judges sat in their robes, their faces grave with the weight of their duty, their minds already made up. One by one, the accused were brought forth. Samuel, barely able to stand after weeks of torture, his body a map of pain. Israel, whose hands shook uncontrollably from nerve damage. Tobias, whose voice was barely a whisper from screaming. And Moses, the accuser, the one whose testimony condemned the others but could not save himself. Because in the cruel logic of blood libel, being the accuser meant nothing. He was still a Jew, still guilty by the mere fact of his existence, still deserving of punishment even as his words sent his community to death. The sentences were pronounced with ceremonial gravity. Death, but not swift. Death designed to serve as spectacle, as warning, as entertainment. Samuel and several others would be burned at the stake. Others would be hanged. But for Moses, the old teacher, the accuser whose confession had given the bishop his case, a special punishment was reserved. He would be sawn in half, alive, from groin to skull. It was a method reserved for the worst traitors, a death so prolonged and excruciating that it existed at the outer limits of human cruelty. The saw would begin its work between his legs, moving upward through muscle and organs, designed to keep the victim conscious for as long as possible by preserving the heart and head until last. It was a death that could take hours, and it was pronounced upon a man who had only confessed because his body could endure no more pain. They came for him before dawn, perhaps as mercy, perhaps as practicality. The executioners moved through the prison with torches, their footsteps echoing off stone walls wet with condensation and despair. Moses was awake, had been awake all night, his mind cycling through prayers and memories, through the faces of children he had taught, and the passages of Torah he had explained in sunlit rooms that now seemed like memories from another life. When they unlocked his cell, he did not resist. There was no strength left for resistance. They half-carried him through corridors, rank with the smell of fear and waste, upstairs and through doors, until finally the cold morning air hit his face like a slap, waking him to the reality of what was about to happen. The execution site was a courtyard behind the palazzo, chosen for its privacy rather than publicity. The bishop had gotten what he wanted from the confessions, had secured his convictions, but even he understood that some deaths were too brutal for public spectacle. A wooden frame had been erected, 2 posts with a crossbeam, designed to hold a man upside down with his legs spread. This position served the executioner's purpose, keeping the victim's blood in his head, prolonging consciousness, ensuring maximum suffering. Moses was stripped naked, his old body pale and marked with the bruises and burns of torture, and tied to the frame. His ankles were bound to the posts, spreading his legs, exposing the vulnerable flesh between them where the saw would begin its work. His wrists were tied to stakes in the ground, stretching his body taut. The executioner was a professional, a man who had killed many times, who had learned to perform his duties without emotion or hesitation. He selected his saw carefully, a long blade with coarse teeth, designed for cutting wood, but equally effective on flesh and bone. He tested its edge, running his thumb along the teeth, feeling their sharpness. Around him stood witnesses, officials required to confirm that justice was done, their faces pale in the pre-dawn light. Some would later claim they heard birds singing as the work began, an obscene counterpoint to what was about to unfold. The executioner positioned himself, placed the saw against Moses's flesh, and began to pull. The first stroke drew blood and a scream that seemed to tear the morning apart. The saw's teeth caught and ripped, each backward and forward motion opening the wound wider, deeper. Blood flowed in pulsing rivers, soaking the ground, coating the executioner's hands. Moses's body convulsed against the ropes, every muscle contracting in a desperate, futile attempt to escape the agony. His screams evolved into something inhuman, sounds torn from a throat that had never been designed to express such suffering. The executioner worked methodically, maintaining a steady rhythm, the saw rasping through flesh and then, with a different sound, beginning to encounter bone. The pelvic bone resisted, requiring more pressure, more strokes, the saw occasionally binding in the wound and needing to be worked free. Minutes became an eternity. The saw moved upward through Moses's lower abdomen, through intestines and organs, each inch a fresh universe of pain. Medical knowledge of the time held that a man could remain conscious through much of this ordeal if the executioner was skilled, if the heart and major arteries were avoided until the end. Whether Moses remained fully aware, or whether his mind mercifully fractured into unconsciousness is a mercy history does not record. What is recorded is that the process took hours, that the sun had risen fully by the time the saw reached his chest, that witnesses vomited and others turned away, that even hardened soldiers found excuses to leave. The executioner continued his work with grim determination, the saw biting through ribs, through sternum, through the tough tissues surrounding the heart. When Moses finally died, when his heart stopped and his screams ceased and his body went slack in its bonds, the sun was well above the horizon. The city of Trent was waking to a new day, merchants opening their shops, mothers preparing breakfast, children playing in streets, still damp with morning dew. And in the courtyard behind the palazzo, a man lay in 2 pieces, his blood black on the stones, his death testimony to humanity's capacity for cruelty, dressed in the robes of righteousness. The executioner cleaned his saw, collected his fee, and went home to his family. The witnesses dispersed, carrying with them images that would haunt their dreams. The bishop recorded another successful execution in his pursuit of justice against the imaginary crime of blood libel. The other condemned followed in the days after. Samuel burned at the stake, his dignity intact even as flames consumed him, refusing to the end to validate the accusations with genuine confession. Others were hanged, their deaths swift by comparison to Moses' agony. The Jewish community of Trent, effectively destroyed, would not recover for generations. The child Simon was declared a martyr, later beatified, his cult spreading across Europe despite the complete absence of evidence for the crime that supposedly took his life. For centuries, the story of Simon of Trent would be used to justify persecution, to validate hatred, to give divine sanction to murder. The truth, that a child likely died by accident or at Christian hands, that innocent men were tortured into false confession, that Moses and Samuel and the others were victims rather than perpetrators, would take 500 years to be officially acknowledged. In 1965, the Catholic Church finally investigated the case, reviewed the evidence with modern eyes, and concluded what should have been obvious from the beginning. There was no ritual murder. The confessions were extracted through torture and were worthless as evidence. Simon was not a martyr, but a victim of tragedy, compounded by prejudice. His cult was suppressed, his sainthood revoked. But for Moses, sawn in half in a Trent courtyard 5 centuries before, vindication came far too late. His death stands as a reminder of what happens when fear overwrites reason, when ancient hatreds find new vessels, when justice becomes indistinguishable from vengeance. The saw that killed him was just a tool. The real weapon was the lie that a community could decide that some lives were worthless, that some suffering was acceptable, that some deaths served a greater good. History records the fall of empires and the rise of kings, the dates of battles and the signing of treaties. But it must also remember the deaths that had no glory, the suffering that served no purpose, the victims who died not for truth but because truth was too inconvenient to acknowledge. Moses died accused of a crime that never happened, killed by a justice system that cared more about maintaining order than discovering truth. His screams echoed in a courtyard and then were forgotten, absorbed into the stones of Trent and the silence of history. But they should still echo. They should remind us that every age thinks itself civilized, that every generation believes it has transcended the barbarism of the past, while often simply finding new ways to practice the same old cruelties. If this story made you think, don't look away. Like, share, and subscribe for more dark truths buried beneath history's blood-stained pages, because the past isn't dead. It's still warning us, still showing us the face we wear when we stop seeing others as human. The saw that killed Moses has rusted away, but the mindset that guided it remains, waiting for fear to give it purpose, for prejudice to give it direction, for silence to give it permission. Remember his name, remember what was done to him, and never forget that justice without truth is just another word for murder.